If you want to talk about actual instances where race becomes an issue, then we can talk about the situation in Minneapolis. So if you haven't seen this awful, awful tape, it really is bad. There's a tape of police officers on the neck of a black perpetrator. The perpetrator apparently was doing some sort of forgery, and they caught him doing a forgery in progress. I don't even know how you do that. Right? Okay, but in any case, there's a forgery being reported. This guy was in his car. He apparently was committing the forgery. Then he got out of the car, and he confronted the cops, and he was resisting arrest. Okay, so at this point, you subdue the person, and then you put them in the paddy wagon, and you take them to jail, right? I mean, that's normally how this works. Instead, a police officer decided it would be a great idea to kneel on the back of the neck of the person. And then the person died, because it turns out that you're not supposed to kneel on the back of other human beings. Now, a couple of things. As I always say, proof of incompetence, stupidity, and evil does not mean proof of racism. And there was a case out here in California, very, very famous case in California, not famous nationwide, in which there was a white homeless man. His first name was Kelly, and I forget his last name. And he was basically beaten to death by the police. He's a white homeless guy. He was quasi-resisting arrest, but not really. They started wailing on him, and he died from it. And this was not considered a nationwide story, specifically because it was about police brutality and cruelty and incompetence, and it wasn't about racism. When if he had been black, then the story would have been racism. So the guy's name was Kelly Thomas. That's right, Kelly Thomas. I remember, it's a big story out here. Okay, that was not considered a name worth remembering, obviously, because he was white. Now, the question in this particular case in Minneapolis is whether this is just police incompetence or whether the police officer was just a vicious racist who decided to kill this guy because he was black or took less of a care about him because he was black. And there were riots last night in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis mayor then went out there and used language that was extraordinarily highly charged. He suggested being black shouldn't be a death sentence. I'm not aware that being black is a death sentence in the United States. In fact, statistically speaking, it is absolutely not a death sentence in the United States. But because every instance of awful police work in which there's a white police officer and a black person has to be perceived as an indicator of broad-based American racism and not as an indicator of police officer sucking at their job. And I know lots of police officers who would look at this and be absolutely horrified on every level. But instead, this turns into a racial debate, even though, again, there's not evidence that this was a racial killing, as opposed to the police officer is just a bad person at his job at the very least.
Being black in America should not be a death sentence. For 5 minutes, we watched as a white officer pressed his knee into the neck of a black man. For 5 minutes. When you hear someone calling for help, you are supposed to help. This officer failed in the most basic human sense.
Okay, he did fail in the most basic human sense. That doesn't necessarily mean this thing was motivated by racism. The only reason that I point this out is that it sort of seems important that if you're going to suggest that race is the motivating factor, you provide some evidence that race is the motivating factor. I sort of like claims that are backed by evidence. Also, worthy of note, is there a single human being on planet Earth, in America? Are there very many human beings? There's some overt racists. People really hate black people. But are there very many human beings in the United States who, if they found out that this guy murdered a black man in cold blood because he was a racist, wouldn't want this guy put on the electric chair? Seriously, like who's out there who doesn't feel that way? But there's an attempt right now to suggest that America, again, is rooted in racism and viciousness. Gayle King, who, again, she's the anchor at CBS this morning, she suggested that basically it is open season on black men after racial incidents. It's open season. It is not open season on black men in America. It is not. And if there's a racist incident, we should all be on the same side. This is the commitment signaling, the commitment to the narrative that America is deeply racist in every way, and every individual instance, every anecdotal piece of evidence, not data, not like broad-based data that's statistical in nature. Every anecdotal piece of evidence is evidence of that broad-based narrative. That is signaling your commitment to the narrative. It is not necessarily signaling your commitment to the truth. I want truth and I want evidence. And I think that once the evidence comes out, we can all be on the same side, because I think that at root, we all have the same belief system here. The same belief system. Racism is bad. Police incompetence is bad. Murder is bad. I feel like we're all on the same page on these things. Okay, but there's an attempt to rush out without the evidence. And I feel like this is the case with so many of these instances. And it's not just with regard to racism. It seems like with regard to everything these days, there is a motivation to rush out and look at cases where there is a deliberate lack of full evidence, make claims that stretch the evidence in order to get to a conclusion and then suggest that if you say, well, I need to wait for the evidence, that you're insufficiently committed to the cause. That's a problem. It's a problem because it actually robs us of our ability to agree on things that we all agree on. Again, I think we all agree racism bad, murder bad, police incompetence bad, right? We all agree on these things. But if you pick instances where the evidence is not fully in on the racism aspect, and you then immediately call everybody who says, I'd like to see the evidence on that, insufficiently committed to the anti-racist cause, what you're actually incentivizing is acting without evidence in order to signal your commitment. Commitment signaling needs to end, because if you are so committed to commitment, maybe you should be committed. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that The Ben Shapiro Show is the largest conservative podcast in the nation. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our content.